used to be, and it wasn't long ago, and whenever people would visit me, wherever I happened to be, they'd arrive, with some label on them. And they'd almost invariably get docked at least 2 stages. Not by the time they left, immediately. And there's something amusing about that, but also it is one of the very critical problems we've had culturally in this institution. This matter of being able to, first of all, rightly communicate to each one what they should be responsible for, developing a system of description and practice. But apart from that, this capacity to be able to observe with individuals the quality of their practice and rightly estimate what their stage of maturity is, not for the sake of labeling them, but for the sake of being able to acknowledge just what they should be responsible for. And so there's been a lot of theater about this over the years, people seeming to advance and yet turned out that they were not at all. Or something very critical about moving on to another stage wasn't even being noticed in their case, and so on. So this is a very, very important cultural matter, this ability to rightly communicate what practice is to everyone, but also to estimate what the level of their practice really is. And obliging them then to be responsible at the right level. And what about this?
Well, you're pointing to it exactly. In the transcript from 718 and a couple others, you've spoken about particularly transitions into FCC and FCC 1 and 1.2 and 2, that there should be very clear changes in a person's life, very functional changes that you see, very clear signs that mark the stage. And I just know that you'll see some people who will come, some practitioners who have greater liabilities in a functional life way. Seems like they don't appear so capable as other people. It seems like perhaps they're screwing up, or they just have more difficulties where their devotion to you may be very, very strong, and their feeling for you and their understanding of the teaching may be strong, but it seems like sometimes there's a disparity between that and the way they are able to, be strong in the world. And that functional capability.
Yeah, well, that's the difference, isn't it? That's the difference between somebody who's maturing in practice and someone who isn't. You've got to be able to function. The obligation our way is an obligation relative to function. If their devotion to me is great, then they should submit themselves whole-bodily in my company. That doesn't mean only to lie yourself down on the floor. It means to put yourself to school, put yourself to work, oblige yourself functionally. This doesn't mean that everyone who does this is going to show the same signs or the same capabilities and so forth. But the test definitely is relative to function. And for people to make transitions, then we must see functional changes, not merely attitudes that seem to be devotional. There must be an accompanying functional transformation. And that's basically then how we tell the difference between the various stages, particularly in the earlier levels of practice. This matter of functional change. Otherwise, everything is reduced to emotional attitudes and what I call breakfast talk, talking school stuff. The test of spiritual life is relative to function. And that means not only doing things differently and more productively and so forth. It means releasing functions from certain kinds of limits, certain kinds of neurotic patterns and so forth. So the process of this practice is one that changes people in their obvious life. It's not just an inner change, it's a total change. But we, of course, must have a tolerance for and also an appreciation of the differences between people and how their real submission to such a practice shows itself. And that's what takes art in this matter of counseling and observing people. What should be measured is the person's practice, and just what they do represent their capability, their talents, and so forth. And are they doing it as sadhana? And does it show, therefore, show differences in their case over time? Can we see differences in them as a personality, humanly, spiritually, and so on? In other words, can we observe the tangible differences that we should observe that mark a transition from one stage to another? If I had come here, you see, this is where I was going to do my sadhana, I think you would have had a lot of difficulty convincing me to take up a career in business or something like that, you see. I mean, I did things like that when I was with Rudy. You see, I was willing to do anything. So I went to a Lutheran seminary, and supposed to be being trained to be a minister and all that sort of stuff. I wasn't a Christian. I didn't have anything whatsoever to do with anything that I was associated with there, you see. Well, maybe I would have gone into business then for just the same reason. But I didn't have any motive in myself to do any such a thing. I'm here to do what I do, you see. And so is everybody else. Everybody's here to do something. Everybody has certain kinds of talents. You don't just have binding tendencies, you have abilities, you see. So you have to find these out and oblige people to use these abilities. Employ them for the sake of everyone. Got to find out what people should be doing. Got to help them to find it out for themselves. We must bring great energy to help people get into, you see. And it's really the least of it, this matter of what people should do for a living and so on. There's some creative attention that should be brought to that, but our struggle with people is relative to sadhana. See, all of you work for a living. You happen to do it inside the institutional structure and the community structure, but you all work for a living. You all basically are involved with things that you know how to do and like doing. I'm not struggling with you about that, although I can tell you years ago I used to have to struggle with people about that, just to get people to be responsible for themselves in a very ordinary way. But I am still struggling with you, you see. I'm struggling with you to make sadhana out of what you're doing. And you know the grand difference between doing what you do simply as an ego, an ordinary person, and doing what you do as sadhana. Well, that's the difference that you, particularly in your position, have to monitor in people, and you have to help them to know that difference, so that whatever they're doing becomes a form of real practice. And if it is a form of real practice, then you will naturally observe the changes in them that mark these transitions, you see. Got any other questions about all that stuff?